Survival horror is most notable in its earliest works, with highly acclaimed titles that come to mind are Resident Evil or Silent Hill. These two lay the foundation for their approach to the format that personified much of the survival horror we know nowadays. It was groundbreaking and impactful for the time, as it allowed for different perspectives when it factored in the gameplay design into its narrative. This would be the archaic tank controls and fixed camera angles that allowed for much more immersion in the 3D environment that was technical wizardry for its time. A marvel to awe at, as you allowed for this depth in this mechanically engaging backdrop for laying the groundwork for the titles after that would be the blueprint to follow. Resident Evil embraced this survival horror element with its limitation in its weaponry that required the player to think strategically in their approach to the gameplay, as enemies were very apparent in these tight linear corridors. Substituting this clunky movement where the button layout you press would be the direction the player model would follow would feel like you were running against water. This would incentivize the player to undergo this exploration and the search for resources that not only aided their survival, but also to engage in finding items to further their level progression. Puzzle solving would also require the player to think outside of the box, which may be frustrating since it is very vague in its context, but also open room for learning through this trial and error, and with this, room for growth. Combat, exploration, and puzzle solving are what laid the foundation for the classic survival horror that would come to follow many years later. For many, this would follow in the bandwagon that Resident Evil was the one to cement the ideas for many other developers to follow for any chance of success in this genre. But while this is partially true, Resident Evil would only be the push to that standard. In reality, it was rather a forgotten relic lost to time that started it all with its incorporation of those mechanics, the backdrop of a haunting environment that gives you dread in its lonely, ominous atmosphere. While a simple yet enticing narrative that we've heard before but feel compelled to follow, it would have players in those classic survival horror games to understand that this would be the inspiration that would rightfully earn the title of the grandfather of survival horror. This would be Alone in the Dark. Developed and published by Infogrames, who would take the helm and pursue this trilogy of Alone in the Dark games, Alone in the Dark's conception was inspired by such influences as H.P. Lovecraft. To be more specific, Gothic and Lovecraftian horror. Much of this layout is seen directly in the environment itself. It's a slow crawl that Edward Carnaby, the main protagonist, would come to find after getting an anonymous letter from a contact to investigate the haunted manor after the apparent death of the owner. Jeremy Hartwood, passed away. This captures his interest as his occupation as a private investigator would compel him to explore the mysterious and ominous forces of demonic evil entities that lie dormant in the manor. This would kickstart the series of events that would become something that is lost in ignorance and bliss, with Edward thinking nothing of the sort at initial glance, as the job was to look and search for a note hidden in a piano, which gives more elaboration about the history and experiences that led to Jeremy Hartwood's death. Much of this narrative is collected in various journal entries from Jeremy Hartwood that give a bit more exposition as to his role in all of this and how these events unfolded, hence why this plethora of hauntings via enemies or the mansion itself is alive. It's a simple yet cohesive haunted house tale that I imagine everyone has heard in their youth and adulthood with such a premise as this. While it doesn't directly tell the player, I do think having to venture out with your findings of this history of Deserto Manor makes the story much more profound. As you assume the role of a private investigator, it creates this immersion of collecting the pieces to the puzzle, and gives much more depth to Edward Carnaby. It's subtle storytelling that is compelling when you allow yourself to explore and affiliate your surroundings with the atmosphere of Deserto Manor. It feels like a slow burn, but all worthwhile, with the story becoming completed with each step you take. What makes this much more compelling is Emily Hartwood, the relative of Jeremy Hartwood, makes the story a bit more personal with this emotional connection that makes the investigation much more sense if you play her character respectively. The downside, however, is a lack of attention to the respective character you play. I do think hearing their thoughts about the events themselves and uncovering such findings would give much more detail to their character. Hearing their thoughts and reactions to Deserto Manor would have been interesting, as voice acting is a prominent aspect of the game.
Past, I considered the news. It seemed clear that Derceto had exercised a thoroughly morbid influence on my uncle's mind. That creaking old mansion with its unusual tales, its secret library door, the ancient upstairs clock, all those occult books that my uncle could not resist reading in spite of his fragile nerves.
While a missed opportunity, I do think this is primarily because of the disk space of the game's memory drive, and the possibility of the hardware limitations back in the day, as there had to be compromises to make games run and function. This would segue into the gameplay of Alone in the Dark. As previously mentioned, much of the gameplay is prevalent in the survival horror side of things, with the fixed camera angles and the tank controls when exploring the environment. You start in the attic in a surprise twist as opposed to the beginning of the manor foyer. I do think this is due in part to the visual imagery giving that depth and immersion to the player that is subtle and conveying the general surroundings of the manor you'll have to search throughout each floor. With this in mind, it gives the player an idea of what they should expect for what's to come. While in the attic, I found myself testing movement and the interaction with the environment primarily. This is because much of the gameplay is very archaic and clunky, which is a huge contrast to the likes of the modern survival horror of nowadays, that's more fluid and grounded with its realism. Back then, however, this gameplay was limited to the extent to which the developers had to compensate with mobility that would be on the X and Y axis of your D-pad, or in this instance, keyboard keypads, to move in each direction adjacent to where the player is facing. So it will create whiplash, as it did with me, that had me need to learn the overall fundamentals. As much as this is an incentive, and with C-level progression, what Alone in the Dark does that impedes the player's progression is this abundance of difficulty. From the very start, it throws enemies unexpectedly at you with no precautions, such as this bird crashing through the window, or the zombies slowly walking menacing towards you. It's unannounced and, in a way, is a jump scare, but is gradually built via sound design. Audio cues are crucial in one's survival in this game, and you'll have to pay close attention if you want to progress forward. It's very dynamic and unique within each enemy you come across, and after the many frivolous deaths on my end, it will become instilled into your memory like a broken record on repeat. For the player to learn from their mistakes, they must utilize the environment to their strength to combat enemies if they have limited resources. Through this trial and error, I learned how complex the game design can be, as you can push objects in such positions that act as a blockade towards enemies to allow the player to have ample room to breathe. With this, you can continue your investigations and finding necessary resources for your survival with such items as health, ammunition, melee and firearm weaponry, and key items in solving puzzles. It's common knowledge in any classic survival horror game, of course, but what makes Alone in the Dark so mechanically innovative is how much attention to detail is littered in this puzzle solving, combat, and exploration. I was blown away by how you could interact with every meticulous item in the environment that would not seem very important to use. But then you realize that even the most simple items become the most essential in unlocking a door or solving a puzzle. You can throw items after their use has become useless towards an enemy and it could deal damage. The aforementioned pushing mechanic incorporates searches or combat via an inventory screen that feels reminiscent of an RPG system. Your actions matter heavily, as you will die a lot in this game. Because the control schemes are archaic and clunky, they have much more difficulty in themselves, where you have to adapt to your best ability to understand through this trial and error. It creates hatred and frustration on the player's part, because of how obsolete and borderline unfair it can be when you get stun-locked by an enemy, can't escape because you're unable to, due to the lack of mobility and awkward movement. This created many deaths that would see me restart many times, which did frustrate me. Also to note is the unpredictability of the manor itself, becoming manifested and alive that throws the player off of how it subverts these expectations, of how it becomes a weapon towards you. You can easily die, with how unexpected the exploration of the manor can become dangerous in your traversal of each floor. It's a reminder that the true horror all along is the house itself, where we find ourselves alone in this darkness. As much as the difficulty curve Alone in the Dark can come off as, it is in this difficulty that creates this immersion that allows the player to learn from their mistakes, to experiment and see what outcomes they could comprise of would lead to the risk yet reward. It's not a compelling game design philosophy that would keep the interest of most players, but I do think if you have patience and are willing to put in the work to understand these game mechanics, then it becomes more enjoyable through this difficulty. It was a journey to experience within Alone in the Dark that made me come to this understanding as to why this game became so critically acclaimed and hailed as an innovation for its time. Seeing sequels that would follow in its footsteps would set the precedent of what survival horror games should create within its atmosphere that allures the player to embrace this experience. While the gameplay system does create many flaws in its gameplay that are frustrating and difficult to manage, I do think that experimenting within the gameplay creates this cohesion and consistency that is worthwhile to the player because of how complex and layered it is, which defines the systems with these mechanics. When this basis makes sense to you, and you articulate your thoughts to eventually understand how to function in this gameplay, you gain this appreciation for its innovation in its design, and why influence other survival horror games that came after it. Alone in the Dark 2 starts with a presentation that is much of a diversion from the first game. What was once calm and subtle is now bombastic and loud. It features Ted Stryker, a business partner to Edward Carnaby, seen infiltrating a manor and house kitchen to stealthily run past undead gangsters and mobsters to save a child named Grace Saunders. A previously seen protagonist you play in Jack in the Dark, a prelude that lacks the combat seen previously and rather focuses on puzzle solving, adopting a much more child-friendly atmosphere as opposed to the supernatural focus in Alone in the Dark. With this, it's very short and not much to give regarding gameplay or narrative-wise, but it does introduce Grace being a main focal point as the driving force to Alone in the Dark 2. Grace acts as a damsel in distress, hence Ted tries to save her from being held captive. Ted, while almost successful, would die to a mysterious toy entity that is reminiscent of the possessed toys in Jack in the Dark. Although this would fail in saving Grace, fortunately, Edward Carnaby would be notified of the transgression and proceeds to attempt to save Grace from the mansion. What is very interesting in the opening of Alone in the Dark 2 is how it provides a different tone than the first game, compensating for an action-packed Hollywood movie approach with how Edward Carnaby stylishly encompasses the special agent personality with his suave swagger with the shades he wears, planting a bomb by the front gate while he runs to wait for the explosion to go off. It's very minor, but you can tell as the player that this opening immediately has a change and shift from the aforementioned supernatural tone of the previous entry, which already gave me a confused look that had me quite worried with the direction of the game was heading, and narratively and mechanically speaking. These fears would be realized as much of the gameplay has a heavier focus on combat as opposed to puzzle solving and exploration. What was once a more limited and secluded feeling that compelled the player to step out of their comfort zone to adapt to the environment was gone with an emphasis on stealth and combat and this open environment. I will say, much of this features more depth to the overall movement being more responsive, which is immediately a nice touch when it comes to traversal. Gunplay with the likes of a Tommy gun, shotgun, and revolver to combat against the gangsters. Stealth, which I say loosely, will see you try to stealthily move past the gangsters in the game to cover ground and gain some ankle room to breathe, to either flee a fight or continue to explore to solve a somewhat minor lacking puzzle. These are the main features that encompass a foundation that would be the current focus of any gameplay moving forward throughout the rest of the gameplay. Admittedly, it's a much needed improvement when it comes to the movement as is quick and responsive as previously stated, allowing room to run and find cover if you need to heal. However, whilst the gunplay is greatly expanded on heavily, it feels like such a trade-off in favor of action instead of survival horror. One can argue that Alone in the Dark featured the paranormal or supernatural in the first game, which comprised much of that atmosphere that correlated to the gameplay in the story. You'd be right, as much of that is seen here as well. However, much of the setting is linear and open, as opposed to small and compressed, where you feel claustrophobic and have no room to breathe. It made exploration filled with dread for the player, because of how unpredictable and uncertain you'd feel as you constantly had to keep guessing. This created that immersion and feeling that pressure and tension. I'd argue that the linearity and open environment in Alone in the Dark 2 creates less of that depth, which compensates for more traversal that allows for free roam where you can feel safe and sound. I found myself dying less here, as opposed to the previous game, because of how much depth that attention to combat with such weaponry catered to the player without much issue in feeling overwhelmed. This is a good thing, but it felt completely detracted from that setting where I felt like I was in an actual horror game as opposed to this action-oriented setting straight out of an action movie. Enemy variety feels lacking too and uninspired, as much of the enemy roster this time around features a more simple cast with this emphasis on mobsters or pirates. While it has a theme, it feels very uncanny and silly, with the idea of having the dead become reanimated and assume the roles of these caricatures feeling surprisingly less believable than the various enemies seen in the previous game. The first game had much more variety, which gave more depth to its design. I felt like within each encounter, your battle and struggle to survive within this progression felt genuinely horrifying because of the inevitability of death, given the many enemies featured throughout the previous entry. What you thought you once saw and experienced only kept subverting those expectations that gave more incentive to your approach and how you would strategize with efficiency in your gameplay that would be worthwhile to you. Here, you would just hide behind cover or either wait for an enemy to approach you from a blind spot and shoot them on the spot or punch them repeatedly until they die. The difference here though is that much of the roster is seen with firearms as opposed to being unequipped without a weapon. I think the idea of seeing an enemy not having weaponry at their disposal, instead of being that much more menacing, even when the player has a weapon on them, makes the combat much more engaging, giving much more stakes on the player's end and how they will solve this problem. I don't want to feel like I am safe. I want to struggle and work to where I can be rewarded to finally be allowed to feel safe because of my hard work and effort that rewards the player with that short grace period and serenity. Much of this departure isn't just in the gameplay, but also in Edward Carnaby's character. It's so odd to see him much more confident in his personality, when given much of his traits were much more cautious and wary of the situation at hand. As a paranormal private investigator, you think he would have much more of a studied and calculated approach to the events seen in Hell's Kitchen that unfold. He feels like he embodies an entirely new character out of nowhere, and doesn't feel like anything seen from the prior entry, where he was investigating with his findings that felt like an actual private investigator would, whilst in a supernatural backdrop that complemented his occupation. Here, he feels like a special agent out of a Hollywood action movie who is an imposter embodying the role of Edward Carnaby. It doesn't outright ruin his character entirely, but it is out of place and detracts not only from his role that gravitated towards his paranormal escapades, which rarely felt natural, as opposed to here where he feels like a different character entirely. Much of this dissonance from the groundwork that the previous game established feels like a loss to its identity. As much as I appreciated the attention to developing the movement and combat, it did feel like a departure from the vulnerability felt in Alone in the Dark 1. That archaic and clunky movement in its exploration and combat was calculated and strategized with your approach to solving a puzzle or combating an enemy. Here, much of that is tossed aside for a backdrop that is a spectacle and grandiose with its story, characters, and gameplay, and Alone in the Dark 2. Alone in the Dark 3 is a balancing act of sorts, compensating for the elements that were established in Alone in the Dark 1 that incorporates the ominous and mysterious setting that solidified that survival horror backdrop, yet sustained the integration of the gunplay and the emphasis of combat seen Alone in the Dark 2. It desperately tries to integrate such qualities with these quantities, to restore that balance that feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. Losing this identity with this change to the format and instead holding out with such risky creative liberties to entice new players to freshen things up, but still trying to hold on to that technical marvel that was once seen a couple of years back, that was profound for its time with its old players. From the sentiment alone, it's truly hard to articulate my thoughts/feelings for Alone in the Dark 3. It's quite indecisive for what it wants to be when it comes to its overall design. This time around, Edward Carnaby is seen traveling to the desert in California to save Emily Hartwood, A previously seen character in Alone in the Dark 1, who was once a deuteragonist, now resulted in the damsel in distress. In this journey, he encounters the familial supernatural and paranormal. Much that depth in the atmosphere is seen here in Blood Gulch, a ghost town in the Mojave Desert that sees the poltergeists who now possess the dead inhabitants that once roamed passively, adopting this theme of the undead zombie cowboys, with revolvers, speaking in their Western dialect, is attributed to the stereotype of this Western emphasis. Here, we find much of the creative liberty seen in the previous entries integrate all the gameplay fundamentals that took the best elements from those titles and incorporated them into one system. Such notable features such as the search mechanic to look and discover for items that are integral to puzzle solving or applying resources such as health, ammunition, or weapons to your inventory reappear as a nice-worthy addition that was really missing in the previous entry, but makes a much needed return. Also returning is the quick and responsive movement and combat that revamped much of the clunky and awkward momentum in the first entry, to be more refined in the sequel and now once again in Alone in the Dark 3. We also see new additions featuring a difficulty setting that surprisingly has a lot of depth with its customization towards Edward Carnaby's health and how much damage he takes. The amount of damage the enemies take, and the level of overall difficulty that could be made either easy for beginners new to the series or hard for more of those purists who want a challenge. Gameplay felt reminiscent of the latter, with these fundamentals incorporated into one recipe that is served to the player by taking all that it experimented with and asserting this level of quality and detail that lays this foundation for the format. In theory, this should all be integrated seamlessly and be the best of both worlds, by solidifying the gameplay to be one that's mastered in its mechanics. But this is by far the case seen here with Alone in the Dark 3. I found that while the movement was smooth and passive to get through in most locations, I did feel like the combat and exploration were such a misstep in the wrong direction, that never did much of anything to improve upon the system. Gunplay is very much the same that sees the player equipped with weaponry that is once again very distinct in its variety, allowing for customability in one's approach to combat. However, much of the time, it still requires such awkward gunfights that will see the player having to be in a specific position if they don't want to take damage, as enemies are also equipped with firearms that deal lots of damage. Sometimes, you have to be out in the open like a moving target if you want to deal any damage, and have to have the trade-off of dealing damage yourself. Physical combat is much of the same here, using the keypads to either punch or kick enemies that have lots of speed in their agility and momentum, but still see enemies take lots of damage for an excruciating amount of time. Exploration also is much of a step in the wrong direction. Much of the searching mechanics seen in the first game is brought back where you can now specifically investigate anywhere that looks notable to yourself. However, it does feel inconsistent at times, as in some instances, you have to hold the spacebar for a long period of time to wait patiently to see if there's an actual item, which is a slog to get through, and creates this pretense to the player that there isn't anything when there actually is. It's also difficult to find items as it's in the most obscure places that you never think to look for and find. Much of that supernatural and paranormal setting is brought back, but feels mundane because of this emphasis on thematics such as a Western theme that brings this very campy cowboy motif. It feels very formulaic and dishonest to the original setting that created this immersive, unsettling atmosphere that felt personal to the player, because of the level of quality and attention to detail in its gameplay, sound, and art design. Oddly enough, it felt natural, and not as obtuse as something like fighting the undead zombies who cosplay as cowboys. The later entries in the trilogy feel very orientated around themes that are shrouded in these spectacles that never really feel like they've grown from the first game, only stuck and lost as to how it can move away from the original to once again form its separate identity, when in reality, it should have just stuck with the identity seen in Alone in the Dark 1, but created something new yet familial that indoctrinated that claustrophobic experience that set the stakes with the pressure and tension you'd feel. Understandably, Alone in the Dark 3 tries to do that here, but for all the wrong reasons. With each entry, it noticeably steps away from that iconic survival horror that felt revolutionary for its time. It solidifies an identity there that can work as a basis for not only the series, but other survival horror franchises to work off of, within this inspiration. But I don't see that experience that once felt special in my first and many playthroughs. Now, I just see a shadow of its former self. Given the obsolete and archaic gameplay that was slowly becoming outdated compared to the latter being Resident Evil or Silent Hill, it was inevitable that Alone in the Dark's gameplay design would eventually become irrelevant to the standards that the console hardware set for the rampant production of technical evolution for video games. This would coincide with the likings of the PlayStation 1, a console that would be prolific for its massive and extensive backlog of titles that would be home to survival horror games. This would pave the way to a new experience for the mid to late 90s of all ages alike to get to see video games from a new perspective, whereas Alone in the Dark would fall behind in its outdated gameplay design that was noticeably in desperate need of an update to its craft. Infogrames would realize this and go on a hiatus from the series for the next 6 years and strive away from its magnum opus to take a backseat this time around and shift its focus to other projects. They would in turn give the license to a newly started developer studio called Darkworks. This developer would go on to develop the 4th installment in the franchise. However, it would create a new continuity that delves from the pre-existing continuity of the previous games, as I imagine as a means to correlate to the modern survival horror games that were akin to the Resident Evil remake for the GameCube, or Silent Hill 2 for the PlayStation 2. It was notably a worthwhile decision, as the series needed to adapt to the standard at the time if it wanted any chance of surviving with its competitors. As previously mentioned, this new continuity would form a new timeline with the release of Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. In the story, you would find the usual suspect that is all too familiar to old veterans of the series, Edward Carnaby. Seen to adopt a more modern attire with a completely new look and fleshed out personality where we would see a completely new character. He would come to find the devastation of his best friend and business partner, Frederick Johnson, to be found dead off the coast of Shadow Island, who initially, before his death, was tasked to investigate the paranormal and supernatural sightings that lay dormant on the mysterious island to uncover information regarding 3 tablets that would cause damnation across the world if let free. As fate would have it, Edward Carnaby would be tasked by his employer to continue the investigation of Shadow Island to solve this mystery and put an end to the sequence of events from unfolding and catastrophizing. This time, however, he won't be alone as he is partnered with a university student, Eileen Cedric, who partakes in joining on the matter as she has unfinished business with a man, Professor Obed Morton, who she believes is her father. She is very much a parallel to the likes of the previous deuteragonist seen in Alone in the Dark 1, Emily Hartwood. With this, the pair head to Shadow Island. This would start the chain of events that follow in their wake of stumbling upon the island after their plane crashes and sees the two become split apart. Eileen starts at the mansion and Edward starts by the forest. This would be the main focal point, being the character switch that the player can play via the playthrough, the latter being Edward Carnaby or Eileen Cedric. From whoever you choose, it would create separate paths and unique perspectives seen through each protagonist that has their own distinctive storyline that sees their journey untangle and eventually, on occasion, see them come to connect separate storylines once paired again.
Finally! Now you are going to tell me what's going on.
I still don't know. Here, I got your stuff.
Thanks.
I never should have agreed to let you come along.
I have my own reasons for being here.
It's very reminiscent of Alone in the Dark 1, starting with a mansion taking place throughout the majority of the gameplay inside with the offsetting environment that comprises the supernatural and demonic entities titled the Creatures of the Darkness, which are the main roster of enemies you have to combat against. Having to endure this claustrophobic atmosphere gives much depth to the unsettling cold ambience that you would hear via the sound design or the art direction. Having 2 separate playthroughs that pertain to these characters is honestly a welcome surprise that allows for replayability to freshen the playthrough, as opposed to replaying the same character through the same gameplay that contradicts the story and creates this cognitive dissonance. In the gameplay, you see both characters become equipped with a starting pistol that has a heavily revamped mechanic system where instead of aiming the weapon via the direction of your character is standing, it allows for your mobility to aim wherever you like. Albeit, much of this freedom is very limited and quite awkward as it makes the trajectory where you are standing a bit janky at times, especially when aiming at an enemy. Having to compensate with more ground to cover so you have room to breathe, whilst having time to aim at an enemy to do effective damage. It sees mostly firearms with a surprising lack of melee weaponry that was seen quite prominently in the previous games. As to why this was made as a consecutive decision, I imagine it was to focus on combat via gunplay, that follows in the footsteps of other survival horror games, as Resident Evil for example. I do think, however, having guns being the substitution this time around as the main focal point is excusable as many of the enemies are varied in their design and come off as menacing and daunting in their appearance, making the use of a firearm as your only line of defense more vulnerable on the player's end. It also helps that the weaponry isn't embellished with capitalizing on a plethora of weapons that are overpowered. The revolver and shotgun are the main standouts that are very limited in their ammunition, which makes item management imperative to conserve your resources. This also applies to first aid kits via health, as you'll most likely take lots of damage. This game has fixed camera angles that can obscure one's vision from an enemy waiting around the corner, and can unexpectedly deal damage towards you. However, the preservation of such resources to your overall combat and health is not much of a deal breaker, as charms, the items that allow the player to save, are scattered throughout the mansion itself and are impossible to miss. Speaking of items, I thoroughly enjoy that items aren't the most intrusive and exhausting items to pick up and search, as there is a mechanic of a bright illuminated light to signify to the player that the item is in this room, may be of important use to the puzzle solving or just in general to the player's inventory. It's also a noteworthy feature that the light has an emphasis throughout gameplay as it combats against the creatures of darkness as a means to impede them from dealing damage to the player. Light is created as a motif. If the idea of investigating Shadow Island wasn't obvious enough, that is utilized uniquely and properly here that isn't merely just a gameplay component, but is a means to see via the dark areas of the liminal corridors or the pitch black rooms, but an actual essential feature that is built upon with much more depth behind it. I am rambling here, but little attention to detail like this is appreciated by me, and shows the amount of level of detail that is developed and translated into the gameplay to complement the design. All in all, I found Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare to be a much needed introduction to the series that takes components of the original continuity to build upon those older ideas, and make intuitive improvements to the former with its unique and distinctive gameplay design. Ironically, I had to adopt many of these attributes from Resident Evil, as much of the muggy, dark, and moody atmosphere takes much inspiration undoubtedly from it when Resident Evil took inspiration from the original Alone in the Dark. I guess everything becomes full circle, but I digress. It became an enjoyable experience that was a warm welcome, especially to fans who liked Alone in the Dark 1 for its atmosphere. With this fourth installment meeting favorable and well-received reviews, do you think that this would continue with the trilogy, much like its former, with this new continuity, with refreshing and innovative ideas, that would allow for a new generation of gamers to enjoy Alone in the Dark in a more modern light, yet retain the identity of the originals? However, this would shockingly fall through, as it would never gain the green light to continue this idea and instead lie dormant and on a hiatus for 7 years. In a turn of events, this would continue to reboot the franchise for the second time, which would change everything once again. To perfectly describe Alone in the Dark 2008 is like throwing darts at a dartboard. You don't know what will land and what will stick, so you desperately hope that something will land. This analogy alone describes my feelings towards this imposter of a game that does everything wrong in trying to revitalize the Alone in the Dark franchise, whilst trying to adopt such innovative and groundbreaking mechanics that admittedly, for its time, could have been seen by the casual player as revolutionary. It assimilates much of that depth that could be paid as a homage to the former entry, particularly the original Alone in the Dark. Its technical limitations do not impede the gameplay, but rather take advantage of, adapting what it could work with to inherit this merit to comprise much of that atmosphere that made that experience so memorable. I know at this point in the video, I sound like a broken record, but it's because much of those creative liberties that manifested much of that merit seen in the previous entries back then, unfortunately, would be that standard that the later games could never get down right. The closest was the first reboot, The New Nightmare, paying homage yet incorporating its own fundamental and innovative mechanics and narrative to give something familial yet new was worthwhile to the player. However, the second time around with yet another reboot doesn't do anything that feels like it pays tribute yet adopts any qualities from the original and does everything wrong by disassociating from the latter. It's truly baffling how each entry progressively creates this burning dread within each of my sessions that makes me lose hope for any assurance for a revival of this franchise. Well, the sentiment would be irrelevant considering the Alone in the Dark remake, but more on that later. The point is that Alone in the Dark 2008 is an entry that takes nothing of value from the resources and tools it was given to create a unique and innovative experience that is worthwhile to the player, and if it does, it's solely for the wrong reasons. To express my frustrations, it's best to lay the groundwork before I get ahead of myself with my rambling. Alone in the Dark 2008 would not be published by the aforementioned Infogrames, nor be developed by Dark Woods, but rather by an entirely new developer and publisher. This time around would be the developer Eden Games, known for their prolific work in racing games, and the publisher Atari. It is the toss of a coin with how this would end up, but there is the saying, third time is the charm. The premise is rather an oddity. In a weird turn of events, you surprisingly don't play in a newly collected continuity that is its separate universe, but rather connected to the original Alone in the Dark trilogy. For some bizarre reason, Edward Carnaby is the same character we play in this entry. He has become an amnesiac and doesn't remember who he is or his purpose in the plot, only having to search for answers to find out the truth. It's a very long stretch to reach this insertion of a previously established character becoming comatose and miraculously waking up in the modern age, who just coincidentally happens to adopt a modern dialect and seems to assimilate quite fine with his acquaintances given the circumstances. It doesn't feel remotely anything like the Edward Carnaby from back then, rather a completely separate character.
My God, I never thought I'd see your face again.
Take it easy. You're hurt. You know him?
No, I don't think so. But then again,
He doesn't recognize me. I'm Theophile Paddington. I'm sorry, Edward. The ritual was so hard on your psyche. A large part of your memories have been sacrificed in the process. Crowley is the one behind this chaos. He made me retrieve the stone.
Theophile, if you know me, who the hell am I?
Edward Carnaby's role this time around is to stop the main antagonist, Crowley, who, like a Saturday morning cartoon villain of the week, plans to inherit the Philosopher's Stone, to unleash an evil entity that would possess the occupants of New York City and unleash chaos and death across the world. This would be the driving force in the series of events that unfold. These events happen to simulate that non-stop Hollywood action movie that saw so much destruction and explosions within the first 10 minutes, that I immediately knew that this was far from the Alone in the Dark that I once knew. To give a general gist of things, to gain this direction the game dives headfirst into, much of the introduction to establish this atmosphere is seen in a burning building that is infiltrated by the evil forces. I don't think the enemies are really given an exact name here, of a demonic entity that possesses humans that see them succumb to becoming zombie-like in their appearance. With this sets the slow burn of the embellishment of gameplay mechanics that is thrown at the player. You have two different sets of camera angles, one that is in third person and the other in first person. Much of this incorporation is to similarly give experimentation for the player's playstyle of choice. Initially, it was an odd inclusion to inherit such an idea as much of the original games were entirely third-person orientated, albeit with fixed camera angles that was rather old news as modern-day standards constantly adapted for change via gameplay design seen in horror games. So, adapting a first-person camera angle would make sense in theory, but this wouldn't be much of use nor a necessity since the player would most likely forget since it's such an afterthought with how forgettable it is. There are sequences where interiors would demand this to have a better view of your general vicinity, but that's because of the overbearing and clunky camera angles that would ironically pay tribute to the likes of the fixed camera angles, which would be a dishonest attempt to incorporate those classic survival horror elements from the previous entries. Third person felt much more natural to me, as I felt like much of the game comprised much of that gameplay, as much of this linearity would be foreseen in an open hub world that would be Central Park, New York City. This allows for much more of this depth, which immerses the player with that modern survival horror combat and exploration. Although, As much as this gameplay tries to find a middle ground for this doctrine, it doesn't ever once feel consistent. This inconsistency can be attributed to much of the combat and exploration seen here. Combat is integrated into this overhaul of melee weapons. Like the original, much of the inanimate objects can be seen as weaponry that can be combated against the enemies seen in the game. This ranges on a wide spectacle seen from chairs, fire extinguishers, pipes, debris, and the ladder. Allows for much experimentation with these mechanics, to utilize for not only combat, but also exploration when needed. An example to give an idea is seeing the player use an object to break down a door, to save a survivor, or as general level progression. If not, then use the chair to set on fire to illuminate the light in your path, or fight the enemies in the game, as all of them are susceptible to damage via fire. This is complemented by an inventory system which also capitalizes on this attention to detail via Edward Carnaby's jacket. It's a unique and seamless system that allows the player to utilize the pistol as your primary firearm of choice, batteries to refill the flashlight, first aid spray to heal yourself, and much more. It's admittedly a cool design that I think works neat and is distinguishable from the usual inventory system seen in the other survival horror games. However, this gameplay system capitalizes on this innovation that is very reminiscent of the original Alone in the Dark, but it overcompensates itself with too much of an overbearing system that overwhelms the player with too many of these mechanics. I found myself much of the time confused with the presentation because of how it always throws something new to the player that fell out of left field with these action set pieces that never allow room for you to breathe. In one instance, you'll see yourself hanging by a rope trying to traverse and scale the side of a building with falling debris, hanging on a ledge while climbing up or down the building that can be difficult to progress because of a lack of detail that can be highlighted to signify to the player to let them know where to go. But this doesn't do that. Having to then solve a puzzle that is very simple and bare bones at best, but is awkward and clunky in this traversal that offsets the player because of how poorly set up it is in its presentation. Parkouring more of this debris and these interiors with awkward movement that never allows time for you to just adjust to the environment to study and traverse for this level progression. And then finally combat with an unpolished and difficult movement in pairing and fighting with melee weapons with a heavy emphasis on motion controls that doesn't translate well with the system. From these examples alone, I think you can get the picture of how exhausting this design to its gameplay structure can be difficult for the player to manage. I think if there was time to breathe within these action set pieces, then it would be welcoming and allow the player to find their footing, to try to get some form of understanding of these mechanics in the gameplay, story, and presentation. The biggest impediment to that success from being realized in Alone in the Dark 2008 is that it takes creative liberties from something that should have been seen and realized here in a survival horror atmosphere. But those pre-existing ideas should have been tested and intuitively incorporated seamlessly to create something new that would have been an identity to the franchise. Instead, we got an entirely different game that was mediocre at best and feels like a far cry from Alone in the Dark. This would seem like the end of the series of this failure to meet sales expectations, as well as fans' expectations. But this wouldn't be the final nail in the coffin. Well, not yet, at least. If Alone in the Dark 2008 was considered the final nail in the coffin, then Alone in the Dark Illumination would be the equivalent of beating up a dead horse. When people say that there was a fall from greatness in this franchise, they really do mean that. Much of everything you've seen thus far within this retrospective of sorts is merely just an appetizer of the absolute full course meal that has yet to be served to you. A meal that is dry, cold, and undercooked. The epitome of disappointment in not just gameplay, narrative, or presentation, but everything in between that fails to capture what Alone in the Dark accomplished almost 2 decades ago that not even a modern survival horror title can do today, is disappointing. Alone in the Dark Illumination is what would be considered the 6th installment in the series, but one that is often disregarded and tossed aside like yesterday's garbage, and it's for a very good reason. Developed by Pure FPS, a very obscure developer that has no track record regarding any previous works in their portfolio, and once again published by Atari. Alone in the Dark Illumination is much like Alone in the Dark 2008, taking some creative liberties from the original's quality and going off those concepts, but diverging far away from the overall presentation, gameplay, and design that gave those games an identity, completely jeopardizing everything by simulating new modern practices that don't translate any of that material or respect it. This game in particular is nothing of a single-player survival horror experience, but rather has an emphasis on online co-op multiplayer gameplay. From just the menu screen alone, you could immediately tell the lack of detail in the menu UI. It feels rushed and not properly finished, going with simple graphics in its design. The most notable features that would capture anyone's eye are character customization and skill customization. This means that this game has skill trees pertaining to the player of your choice that you unlock via level progression, as well as character cosmetics that are much like the latter. There are 4 classes: the Hunter, the Witch, the Engineer, and the Priest. These are your go-to party members that you would typically see in an online match, with this collaboration between members given the incentive to go about and accomplish objectives whilst fighting off creatures of darkness. This is basically the setup for the player to go off of. Not once is there any tutorial or guide to give some sort of helping hand to the player to understand what their overall objective is, just purely learning from experimentation and natural gameplay progression. This all sounds like an organic thing to experience, as most, if not all, survival horror games incorporate this ideology into their design. This is true, but the problem here is that it never innovates off this thesis, nor allows for any room for improvement, or reason to care in the slightest for anything this game has to offer. It rather creates frustration and this tedium with how overwhelming enemies can be, as there are waves that spawn as a means to be a blockade in your path. This is fine, but all you really do to combat them is just either use the M16 or the revolver. This gives the player lots of health and ammunition to never feel underpowered, but rather comfortable and okay with their bearings. There is never any difficulty, just RNG and you'll be okay. You also have this emphasis on light, hence the name in the title. This is used as a means to hinder the enemy's movement and expose them as vulnerable and susceptible to your damage output. This has nothing to give intuitive features or mechanics that would see you have to strategically plan out an attack or ration your resources. But overall, it's this repetitive gameplay that would see you shoot enemies, run away to do objectives littered around the map, and then finally get to the safe room. It's meaningless and isn't anything to incentivize the player to want to keep playing with how lacking in content and variety it has in its final product, even if you can call this a final product at all. I say this not out of spite, but out of disappointment with how much care I genuinely developed for this franchise over time, with how I grew such a fondness for its incorporation of unique and creative gameplay design that made those original titles worthwhile of your time, that while frustrating, was an experience that required the player to think strategically, that allowed for this enlightenment to the puzzle solving, combat, and exploration that was insightful and informational. It was masterfully done, and to see that fall from glory with this soulless cash grab of a marketing stunt is truly a shame. From here on out, the franchise would seem finished and left to finally rest as it should have years ago. But maybe, just maybe, there's a small glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. After a decade of mediocrity to the prior installments that were unsuccessful reboots to revive the Alone in the Dark franchise many times it has tried, we have once again for the 4th time now seen a reboot of sorts to recreate that Alone in the Dark experience from many years ago. However, this time around, it's much more faithful as it follows heavily in the footsteps of the original Alone in the Dark with this remake and reimagining. After many trades between publishers with the license and rights to the Alone in the Dark IP, eventually, THQ Nordic would own the license and be granted access to fully develop and make a new installment to the franchise. Thankfully, they would go back and study to see what made that franchise so special all those years ago, and translate that archaic and clunking gameplay of back then into one seamless experience of a modern survival horror approach, to the standard that is seen nowadays. With this remake and reimagining, we are fortunate enough to get a bit of breadcrumbs to what that could be like with this prologue chapter that gives a bit of context yet is still very mysterious and ambiguous in its narrative, that keeps the player guessing as to what is to come. Much of the storyline follows the main premise, seeing Edward Carnaby and Emily Hartwood travel to the Sturdo Manor after the passing of her uncle, which unleashes a demonic evil on the property that they must put a stop to. We get to see somewhat of how that could pan out with this demo as we play Grace Saunders, a previously seen character who was playable in Jack in the Dark, which pays heavy homage to that prologue that connected to Alone in the Dark 2. Much of that is transcribed here with an emphasis on exploration. We see the perspective of everything boiled down through the eyes of Grace, which gives a bit of an interesting take as you feel like she is very unaware of the horror that is subtle yet slowly building around here. It's in the lens of innocence that makes that perspective engaging, as it showcases how ignorance can be bliss through playing as this child. I liked how you see how Grace thinks like a child and is resourceful as she creatively traverses the environment when she comes to find an obstacle. It gives a bit of depth to the character. But other than that, there isn't much else to see from this demo, as it's excruciatingly short as it runs 10 minutes long, give or take. But it does give a taste of what is yet to come. I'm invested in this remake from what I've seen so far, and I'm holding out my expectations until I've experienced what this remake and reimagining have yet to offer. And that is it, a review of every Alone in the Dark game. This was quite the experience for me, one that had so many highs but so many lows. I could finally understand why this franchise was forgotten, and why it has never made such a comeback, nor was a mainstay with such survival horror franchises like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. The biggest problem was that it never properly had growth to develop from its innovative qualities for its time, that was initially a technical and, mechanically speaking, marvel for players back then. I'd never seen such gameplay like that before. I had the blueprint, but strayed further and further away within each entry that became a shadow of its former self, a loss of its identity, which is why this grandfather of survival horror was only left as a memory. But given the amount of attention to detail and paying tribute and respect to the original material of the Alone in the Dark remake, maybe we can finally see this forgotten franchise have a chance to finally be redeemed. I want to thank my monthly channel members for their monthly subscriptions, Specky Bandit and Francis Andrew Lugo. I also want to thank all of you for watching, especially if you got this far in the video. These videos take much time to make, and it always means the world to me to see people watch my content and hopefully take something from it that's informational or insightful. I always do my best to deliver where I can. If you guys enjoyed watching me review every game in this franchise, then please give me ideas of your own of what survival horror games I should review next in a specific franchise of your choosing. I make frequent polls to interact with the community to see what you guys would like to see me cover, so please feel free to check that out if you're interested. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please consider a like, comment, share, or if you think I earned it, a subscribe, as it helps the channel grow in more ways than one. Anyway, I've rambled far too long now. As always, thank you for watching, please have a great day, stay safe, and goodbye.